Hello, welcome to another episode of A Junior, a Senior, and I. I'm so excited about our guests today. Rob and Steven are joining me to discuss extreme programming, a topic I know a little about because I read the book, but I have never experienced in practice, so I'm so excited to hear what they have to tell me about that. But first, let's meet them. Rob, could you introduce yourself in 3 sentences or less, please?
Yeah, hey Pablo, it's nice to be here. I'm Rob Whitaker. I'm a senior developer and director of software development at Thoughtbot. I've been professional web developer for almost 2 decades. I've been at Thoughtbot for 8 years, been doing Ruby since 2011. I live near Manchester in the UK. I think that covers everything. Oh, I should remember as well, I'm also co-organizer of the Northwest Ruby User Group, which is the Ruby User Group in Manchester.
Nice. And that covers everything then. Thank
Yes,
you
yeah,
very
yes.
much, Rob. Stephen, could you introduce yourself in 3 sentences or less as well, please?
Well, I will try. That's not one of my sentences. Neither is that. I'm Stephen Baker. I've been in the software industry for almost 30 years professionally. I got started early. I discovered XP shortly after the book came out. I've been doing Ruby since 2001, I think. And I'm sorry I created RSpec. But also, you're welcome. I also did the first version of Minitest Mock.
You could say we are welcome for both of them. Thank you very much. So let's start with the most obvious question. What is XP?
Well, I'm sure a lot of people listening actually know the software industry doubles in size every 5 years. A lot of people listening haven't seen the documentary about Spinal Tap, where they talk about on their amplifiers, they wanted it to be louder. So everybody else's amplifiers go up to 10, but Spinal Tap's amplifiers go up to 11. And in XP, we just take all of the things that we do that are good, and we'll get into the details, I suppose, pair programming, testing, and stuff like that, and we turn all the dials up to 11. So if pair programming is good, do it all the time. If testing is good, do it all the time and do it first. If interacting directly with users is good, do it all the time. It's about turning all the dials up to 11.
You mentioned the audience. I didn't know about the anecdote you shared either.
You definitely look old enough that you should know about Spinal Tap. And if you haven't seen Spinal Tap, the documentary, you definitely have to watch it. It's hilarious.
You're in for a treat. I'm jealous that you're in that position that you haven't seen it yet.
It's great. It's especially great the first time around.
It's definitely on my list now. But yeah, I have not watched it. I was going to say sadly, but from your reaction, luckily, because I get to experience it for the first time.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
What about you, Rob? Anything to add to Steven's definition of XP?
I really like the idea of turning everything up to 11 because I definitely see it as, I kind of see it the other way. It minimizes all these things that normally take too long. So you're turning up like the things you can take away. I really like the way it's more iterative. You're trying to think, what is the smallest thing I can ship now? How do I get feedback from my customers as soon as possible? And how do I make sure that we're pointing in the right direction? That's the thing I like. And that makes it sound like hectic and busy, but it's not. It's smooth and fast. You get into a nice flow about things.
Steven, you mentioned some of the practices of extreme programming. Do you follow them all to a T while you do it? Or is there some room of maneuver there where you get still a lot of the benefits, but you can adapt a bit to it?
That's a good question. I would say that if it's up to me, I would do all of those things all of the time, but modernized. I wouldn't necessarily pair program. I would probably mob today. And mob programming didn't exist when XP was discovered or invented or whatever you want to say. I'm not sure if Kent or Ward said this, but they said that basically the practices for XP come from developers as they've been observed in the wild. And so if you look at old pictures of when Unix was being created, you'll see pictures of Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson and Rob Pike and all sitting around one teletype. And if you look at early pictures of Apple Computer, you'll see Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in the same room. And of course, in Apple's case, it was probably, there was a paid photographer there and they did that on purpose. But this is, if you go to any conference, you will see nerds naturally congregating around one computer or one idea rather than everyone sitting with their headphones off in the corner hacking. And you'll see that as well. But the real magic happens when people do that. And so if smart people that are inventing and creating things are going to naturally work together, what happens if we do that all the time? And the same thing goes with automated testing. So to answer your question, yes, I do all of those things all of the time if it's up to me. Now, sometimes I work on teams where people don't like writing tests and I'm the only one, and that makes it difficult. And so I might get a little bit lax, although I'm very unlikely to get lax on testing in particular. But pair programming, absolutely. Pair programming takes two. You have to have somebody who's willing to pair with you. And on a lot of teams, it's very difficult to find somebody who's even willing to share their screen and pair with you. And in a lot of contexts, not so much in consulting contexts, but in product development contexts, it's very difficult to get the end user in the same room for a discussion. And so doing proper user stories and having direct customer interaction, we call it the customer in XP. Other methodologies introduced what we call the product owner to sort of stand in as the user. So it's not always possible, but where possible and where I'm able to, I do. If I'm in charge, yes, 110% of the time, but I'm not always in charge.
Indeed. And Rob, because I'm guessing that since ThoughtBot is remote first company, some concessions might need to be made, or do you manage to follow all of the XP practices to a T in your day-to-day?
It's been interesting because I reread Extreme Programming Explained this year, and I suddenly realized I'd first read it when I first started out as a professional programmer, and I realized, oh, all the things I do are based like on my initial reading of this, and then going back, I was able to solidify what I knew. But there's a great image of all the practices of XP and how they link together, and I've started to use that because ThoughtBot's a consultancy. When we go work with people, I can then look at what is missing from this graph, and it might be tests, it might be pair programming, it might be access to the customer, it might be continuous integration, less so nowadays. But if you take one of those practices away, the whole graph starts to fall apart. And so you can look and say, oh, we need to add in simpler design, or we need to add in smaller releases to get things back in progress. But as well, being a consultancy, we have to figure out how that works with that organization. So you might be working with a larger organization that's a bit more waterfall. They like to do a lot of design up front, or they might like to have a QA process, and QA doesn't necessarily fit with XP. You have to figure out how to get the testers more to the beginning of the process to help you write the stories and things like that. And it's the classic software development thing. It depends. We strive to get towards that process and use it as like a shining light for where we want to get to, and figure out how it works in different situations. I keep a copy of that graph in my notes so I can pull it up like when I'm talking to people and say, look, if we don't do test is like the core one, then all these other things fall apart. And remote first, we're lucky enough that when we negotiate opportunities or engagements, we say that we work with you, not for you. So like we expect to be working. And so we use tools like Tuple to pair and mob. It's a great way to share knowledge, pair programming, rather than having to write stuff down, because who's got the time and energy to go write down what they were thinking an hour ago at least, or like a day ago, or it slowly becomes a week and a month, and then it just gets lost. Whereas if there's 2, 3, 4 of you just having a conversation, then it's much easier to pass that information around. And then if one of you wins the lottery and doesn't turn up the next day, then everybody's got enough knowledge to keep going.
Sure. You said the time and the energy, but also the wherewithal of thinking, hey, this is nugget of information that I should pass on. Whereas in a conversation that goes naturally and everyone was more or less on the same page, or at least more than one person was on the same page, if you're doing pairing or mobbing, right? I was gonna at first ask about the benefits of XP, and I'm still gonna ask about them, but is there a drawback first of doing XP? Are we sacrificing something if we're working on a full extreme programming mode? I see you both thinking, so I'm assuming my question is not that bad.
It's a good question. I think a lot of the things that you see when people will talk to you about, oh, design doesn't fit with it, that whether that's UX design or whether it's architectural design, or you're not thinking about the bigger picture. But I think that's a kind of a lack of trust in extreme programming. I know Kent Beck, the writer of the books, has said more recently, like, have like ad hoc infrastructure, do enough until it's not working, and then start to change things. And it's the same with the code. And there's the idea of design as well. I think that works with when you do your initial release, is that having that skeletal flow of this is the flow of it, that's our design, and then we iterate on top of it. And so you would have done some prototyping to figure out, but it's kind of those larger, higher level views that can maybe just don't come out where you expect at the beginning, but that's okay because you, in theory, should be going in the right direction. I don't know if that shakes anything loose for you, Stephen.
Those are good points. The two things that come to mind for me are not necessarily drawbacks of XP, but of shoehorning XP into places where it might not be comfortable. Although I guess maybe the second one is drawback. I'll get there. A lot of organizations are very rigid and have strict requirements about certain things. I spent a lot of time in fintech, for instance, and a little, less time, but it's similar in like biomed and healthcare type stuff. And when there are regulatory environments and things like that, the organizations grow in ways that require certain things that are harder to produce, or you need to discover a new way to produce those things. Because a lot of the knowledge that people have, is very, very much a waterfall based thinking, because a lot of things, project management, and let me dick finger, oh, nobody can see it, but when you do the air quotes, I call that dick fingers because you're usually being a dick when you're doing it. I'll dick fingers project management. So project managers learn Gantt charts and, time-based type milestones and stuff like that. In XP, you can definitely meet those targets and stuff, but there's not a one-to-one mapping. And so it's sometimes a little bit more difficult. But I would say those are cultural drawbacks to doing XP. Some people are just, have a strong discomfort with it. You said you were going to get this much done this week. You said you were going to get 10 done this week, and you only got 8 done this week, so you didn't deliver. Well, no, we delivered 8. We didn't not deliver 10. We did deliver 8, and things like that. The other thing that I would say is slightly difficult, aside from the organizational stuff, would be if you just don't have access. Like, you may not have access to somebody in the customer role. If you're building a product and you're doing the first of its kind and nobody's ever seen it before, you are your own customer. This happens a lot in open source. Scratching your own itch. You're your own customer. So you have to find new ways that are not covered in the book about seeking external validation and asking questions. And who are you iterating with if you're building this thing by yourself? And how can you do XP by yourself and things like that? So there are some drawbacks, but I would say that the drawbacks are simply that it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. You have to be agile about it. You have to be constantly changing your ideas. And I guess the last thing, I said 2, but I lied. The last thing, off by 1 error, the last thing that I'm thinking is that we discovered the XP practices now going on 30 years ago. And a lot of things have changed. We're not all sitting in the same room anymore. People are remote. Internet connections are faster. More software is online. Back in 1990, in the late 90s, when XP was sort of discovered or invented or whatever you want to say, the software was shipped off and stamped on a CD and put in a box and shrink wrapped and put on a shelf. And so the needs were different. So I would say that, we have to constantly go back and look at those things, these ideas that came out in the late 90s and revisit them. But also, I think that XP was forward-looking enough that things like continuous integration, which, by the way, a lot of people think they're doing continuous integration and almost nobody is, things like continuous integration and automated testing and stuff like that are easier now than they were before. Running tests was expensive in the late 90s. I've been on projects in the late 90s where it took 40 minutes or longer, if you weren't careful, to build your project before you could even run the tests. And we don't have those problems anymore. So I would say, even though XP was incredibly forward-thinking, the world has changed, and we need to start accommodating that as well.
Yeah. Anything you want to add, Rob?
No, it's the idea of the speed of tests reminded me of a story of my dad. My dad used to be a tape operator in the 70s, and he used to work shifts. And so his job was to come in at night, load the programmers code onto these tapes, run the tests overnight, and then dump the log output out onto somebody's desk first thing in the morning. And so the test used to run overnight. And that just reminded me of that little story. My dad just sitting around with his friends, loading tapes and running tests, and then giving the output in the morning.
I've seen some Rails projects where the tests take almost overnight to run.
Oh, really?
I was gonna
Cool.
make exactly the same comment.
Wow. Okay.
I don't tend to see the good ones.
Yeah.
People don't call me when everything's running well.
Yeah. I can empathize with that.
Okay, if I go back to the practices, what are for you the minimum ones? Like you go into a new project, it's completely waterfall. Where do you start? Getting them towards a more extreme programming mode of operation.
Yeah, I'm just firing up my graph of the practices so I can think about where I'd probably start. I think the pair programming is a core thing. Even just to be collaborating as a team. There's so much about you being one team at the core of extreme programming, and just having those open conversations to figure out what's the problem we're actually trying to solve here, and then figuring out what's the smallest step. So it's kind of an abstract one, but it's just talk and figure out and go from there. After talking would be, what's the simplest, smallest thing we can ship to add value, and then begin doing that, and then iterate on that and go from there, I think would be my starting point.
Okay. And you, Stephen, what would be your starting point?
I would agree with what Rob said, but I would add, when non-nerds ask me what I do, and I was a consultant for like most of my career up until recently, I often tell non-nerds, I explain my job to them, is I go into software teams and just repeatedly say, have you tried talking to each other? So collaboration, I don't necessarily care if it's pair programming or not, but my number one thing is to get people talking to each other, and especially outside of their own bubble. The second thing I would say, the next smallest step is a good point. A lot of teams that I go into don't have even an elementary understanding of tests, and they often have very large test suites, but they don't understand why they're writing tests or what they're good for or whatever, and they don't really take it seriously. And so I definitely focus on, we can move forward with higher levels of confidence more rapidly if we call our shots. If we say, in 10 minutes, the software should do this thing that it didn't do before. Things like that. But for me, item number 0 is collaboration.
I think that's one of the things about XP is that it does tend to level the playing field. So often you can go into a project and stuff's just fed down to programmers from a product owner, from management. But when you are talking to each other, and if you use XP, it does tend to level everybody out. Everybody's involved in the designing of the product, like not necessarily the UX design, but the designing of the technology. The testers are involved at the beginning. They're not just waiting for stuff. The customers are involved in sort of writing the tests, and everybody's kind of involved with everything. So it does bring itself to allowing people to have more say in more things.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I started a team. We were on a tight timeline to deliver a product with a tough client in a very complicated space. But I had a team of, 8 or 10 of the most experienced and best people I've ever worked with in my life. It was a really great experience. And one of the people that the client gave us was their QA guy. And he showed up and he said, hey, I'm not really a programmer. I write, I know how to do automated testing I've used Selenium and I've used Capybara and stuff like that, but I'm not really a programmer. And so what should I be doing for the next 3 or 4 months while we wait for you to write software? And I said, dude, your job comes first. We need to figure out what the first minimal feature we have is. And then you're going to show us how in your organization you would write the test to demonstrate this. So what's the simplest thing? And his mind was blown. And he was very new at the job too. He said, well, obviously and he was kind of confused. He said, well, obviously the simplest thing that the app has to do is boot and show the login screen. And I said, okay, so write a test for that. Well, I don't know what tools we're going to use. Well, what tools have you used before? What does everybody else on the team know that's available that might be useful? And this guy who thought he was just going to sit on his hands for 3 or 4 months, and he was very worried about like losing his job if he was sitting around on his hands, he ended up contributing first. And because we were mobbing, he said, well, I really would like to learn how to be an actual programmer instead of just a tester. And so whoever was running the screen share at the time turned off their screen share and said, good, share your screen. You're a programmer now. That highlighted the full team aspect in a way that I just absolutely loved. It just became an entirely collaborative activity.
Thank you for sharing that anecdote. As you say, it's really illustrative of what it should be, right? And I can see it also in that anecdote that it feels like extreme programming, for everything that it is. It's like 30 years old, etc., etc., etc. It still feels kind of countercultural to what we see in most organizations, right? Like you go into an organization and people have roles and people code on their computer, etc., etc., etc. How come? I know that it's quite a large question, but any of you have a possible explanation of why it's not more widely adopted?
Oh, yeah, I would love to jump in here first. Apologies. I thought of something right away. It's because it flips the power dynamic. In a traditional sort of factory manufacturing setting or in the waterfall thing, it's very top down. Management tells you what to do, they deliver the mandate, and then the team scrambles to figure out what that meant and try and deliver what they think they were told, and so on. And the management thinks they have a very clear picture of where they're going to be in 2 weeks, in a month, in a year, in 2 years. And they think that all they have to do is say things and they will just happen. And there might be some negotiation in sort of the middle about, no, it can't be done that fast or whatever, but it's very top down from the people who want the thing. And the people last in line to make decisions are the people actually doing the thing, the people on the ground. And in XP, we flip that power dynamic and we say, you can have whatever you want. You just have to tell us what is most important and you'll have that first. Because then we are telling the people, again, dick fingers, above us, you answer these questions and then we will do it in the best way we know, and you're not allowed to tell us how. That's, I think, why we still struggle with adoption, is because it flips power structures, or it flips the idea of the power structures we think we have.
Yeah, I always think with any, I was going to do dick fingers then, any agile methodology, it's always about trust. I think that a lot of, if you implement XP, then you build trust back up. And the reason why organizations want to have documentation up front, or they want to have a testing phase afterwards in a waterfall, is because they don't trust that what they say they want is going to be what they're going to get. And then again, when we've built something, they don't trust that it's going to be that. And so if you use extreme programming, they're involved in the conversation anyway. And you can show them in small iterations that they can trust you because you're building what they want. For example, there's a great analogy that a recent client gave me about, we were talking about estimates. And I always think that as soon as people are asking for estimates, it means they don't trust the team are going to build what they need. So, and they're saying, like, the client said, instead of somebody saying, how long is it going to take to build the bridge? As developers, we say, what type of bridge do you want in the time? So, and then you can get down to, well, why do you want a bridge in the first place? Because they might be asking for this big steel contraption that's like so long, wide, and so, but the actual problem is they want to cross a river. By having the conversation, you can go, okay, well, to cross a river, we just need to put a plank down. And that's your first iteration. You've solved the problem. And then they say, well, people keep falling in. Okay, iteration 2, we're going to put some handrails up. And then they say, oh, actually, we wanted to put cars across it. But already we found that just by doing smaller iterations, people stop asking for estimates because they can see they're getting what they want and it's moving in a direction. And all of a sudden they can go, you get to the point where you put a wide plank down that a car can go across, and they're like, okay, that's enough. Stop. We don't need to spend any more time and money on this. We can move on to something else. And I thought this was only a few weeks ago, but it's one of the most terrific Agile or XP anecdotes or analogies that I've heard. And I keep using it, and it works on so many different directions.
Yeah, I like that. And also, when you build trust, you increase confidence and comfort as well. So if the client is convinced that they want a big steel structure that can do everything all at once and they want to know how long it's going to take, but you iterate, they might find that, oh, well, you know what, we thought we wanted this, but what we actually want is that other thing. And boy, are we glad that you didn't tie us to these decisions that we made up front. I used to work in government a lot of years ago, and I can think of two examples, only vaguely because they were like almost 30 years ago now, of bridges being built that ended up costing a shitload of money and also ended up not being fit for purpose. One of them ended up getting built, and we forgot that boats needed to go under them, and the boats were taller than where the bridge sat. And so it would have been too expensive to fix that bridge. You couldn't iterate on the bridge at that point. But what they ended up doing was the boats had to be redirected anyways until the bridge was finished. And they found that, oh, well, actually what we need is this other more expensive thing over in this place to get our time back, because there was a diversion, right? And another bridge, we had a problem with the weight limits. It was built and we realized we didn't know that there was a quarry on one side. Or I was only tangentially related to the project, so I had really nothing to do with it. But the people involved didn't take into account that there was a quarry on one side of it, and the quarry might like to run dump trucks across it. And the weight limits wouldn't support dump trucks full of rocks. We would have found that out very quickly. If you start building a bridge, pretty soon the dude who owns the quarry is going to walk up and say, hey, this is going to change my business. This is going to change my life when this bridge is done. And, the people building the bridge are going to say, oh yeah, what do you want to use it for? How does it change your life? Well, I have a quarry over here, and I'm going to drive big trucks full of rocks across it. And immediately somebody can pull the red handle and say, whoa, stop work. The thing we're building isn't going to work for this guy. Do we want to support that feature? That's super important. And that's where the agility comes in, right? The ability to change your mind, basically.
One of the reticences I've encountered when trying to be more extreme programming or more agile in the end of the day, it's quite similar, is that people will say, okay, but if you build the minimum thing, I cannot present that to customers. So actually you need to build this, and that, no matter how you do it, but then we'll show it to customers. How do you deal with that sort of argument? Because at the end of the day, it's the same as if you were building it from scratch, right?
I've been thinking about the difference between releasing and shipping. So you can ship to production, but to like a limited set of people. And you can then go, okay, but is this doing what you expect? Is it then ready for release? And if you look at some of the other extreme programming books, so was it Planning Extreme Programming? They talk about release planning in that. And so you have several iterations in a release. But then in those iterations, you're always shipping, you're just not releasing. And so you can show a limited set of people what that is, and then you might decide to release sooner. And so my counter question would, how would that person know that they have everything they need to release? How does that customer know that they have everything they need to release to be able to show? Because at the very beginning, they're going to know the least possible about what's going to be in there. And so that's I always say the first plan is the worst plan. And it must be true because it rhymes. Because that's when you know the least. And so at that point, that's when they know the littlest, the minimum. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is an XP thing or just comes from the community at the time, but we often say in the community, make every decision at the last responsible moment. And the last responsible moment is, how long can I kick this decision down the road before not having made that decision is irresponsible? And there are a whole bunch of things that we think are super important. I mean, I went to a dev meetup a couple of years after I moved to Sweden in Malmö, and there was these 3 kids who were fresh grads that were doing a startup, and they'd been working for 3 months, and what they had to demo was their Kubernetes configuration that they were very proud of. And I was trying not to be the dick in the room and saying, hey, what is your actual product? Oh, well, we're going to build this. And I'm like, yeah, well, when are you going to start? Well, we need the infrastructure first. And I said, well, why don't you just build the thing? Well, if we just build the thing, then it'll only support like 10 users. And I said, well, that's 10 more than you have today. So why are you spending time on building this thing? And that is a lot of teams. I mean, even teams that claim to be XP will throw a user story on the stack that says, set up Kubernetes cluster. And I'm a huge fan of Kubernetes lately. And one of the things I used to be famous for on Twitter was shitting on Kubernetes, but I've seen that it has earned its place. You may have heard this phrase before, but I'm pretty sure it's mine. I can't find an earlier one of it. I wrote on Twitter, Kubernetes is the ancient Greek word for more containers than customers. And it's That kind of thing. Doing the things that you don't need today is wasted effort if you never get a customer. And that's super important. I don't remember why I thought about that, but on releases versus shipping, I recently changed my career where I'm not a consultant anymore. I work on a very large old project that I love. I work on the open build service at SUSE and on Ruby packaging, and I love it. And we have a lot of these discussions about don't deploy on Fridays, or what good is continuous delivery if we're in a bank and we're only allowed to release quarterly anyways. And continuous delivery is not a practice about delivering continuously. It's a practice about making sure that you can deliver at any time, keeping your product in a constantly releasable state. It's not about constantly releasing. End users hate that, by the way, when you come in the middle of the night and replace their web browser with a new web browser that works differently, or a new piece of software that, when you've moved the cheese around. End users hate that. They don't want you shipping continuously. They don't want you shipping 100 times a day. But they want you to be able to ship 100 times a day, because if you can ship 100 times a day, you can ship at any given second when any bug was fixed. And that's the important thing about these practices is, boil it down to its essence and then figure out how to apply that.
Kind of building on what Stephen was saying there about that, building up Kubernetes first. You get a lot of people who kind of want to design the database first before building anything on top of it. And it's the same thing, like, oh, we need to know what the schema is. Well, and XP makes something so customer focused. Well, show me the screen or the report or whatever, and what data you want it, and hard code that data and show me what it looks like. That's your simplest thing. And then go, okay, well, where do those data points come from? And work backwards from there. I think a lot of XP is working backwards a lot of the time from a very static point of view, and then adding functionality in and understanding, like, where's this data come from? Why do we need this? Why do we need Kubernetes? Why do we need to support more than 10 people? Like Stephen said, like that's enough times.
Yeah. If you get acquired, you only have one user.
Do you guys think that there is a miscomprehension of new people like me that came into the software industry later? Like, I've been coding for 6-ish years, and I've heard the terms, and if I hadn't read the book, I would have gotten something different from the terms. Like, as you said, right? Continuous delivery, my first instinct is, yeah, I need to be able to ship all the time, and I need to ship all the time, not only be able to. Test first means I need to do a system test from the beginning or stuff like that. Do you think there is this miscomprehension because this idea is getting a bit old? Not old in the sense that it's outdated, but old in the sense that it was discovered, invented, whatever you want to call it, 30 years ago?
Yes. I think that this is such a big problem that one of my closest friends and I recorded 3 episodes of a podcast that never got released because I suck at editing and releasing, called Described as Practiced. And then he got a job that prevented him from podcasting, where we would basically take a single definition. And the first episode that we recorded was on continuous integration, which is, here is how it was originally described, the problem it was supposed to solve, and what that meant at the time, and also what does that mean today. And here's what people are actually doing when they say they're doing continuous integration. And so I think that you can pick any one of the practices in the software industry, and I have probably already thought about it at great length and tell you exactly how most people get it wrong because they don't understand where it came from. And I'll be very quick on continuous integration. Continuous integration has absolutely nothing to do with running your tests on every commit. Absolutely nothing to do with that. That's a symptom or a side effect or just one of the things that you do so that you can continuously integrate. Continuous integration is about, as often as possible, integrating all of the different changes that are happening at the same time. The pull request workflow with GitHub Actions running your tests is not continuous integration. That is automated test running. That's not continuous integration. It's a tool that helps you do continuous integration. But most people, when they say we have CI, they mean we run the tests on every commit. That's not continuous integration. I would argue that if you use branches, you're not doing continuous integration. If you are not committing everything to master, that's not continuous integration to me. Now, maybe It's okay to not want continuous integration. There are reasons why you might want a branch. I don't have any personally, but you are not doing continuous integration if you have branches that are being developed separate from each other. So that's one example of the things that we say, misunderstandings of the ideas. And I could tell a story on almost all of the practices that we talk about. Kubernetes is another one of those, and I can even be super quick on that. Kubernetes was invented at Google because Google needs something like Kubernetes. Are you Google? No, you probably don't need Kubernetes. Now, DHH says complexity is the tax you pay on the path to simplicity. Kubernetes is now really well understood and really well done. And so it's a lot easier for smaller teams to take advantage of those things that Google has always needed. But Kubernetes is not for you, is usually the correct answer, and things like that. So yeah, I think this happens with everything in the software industry.
Yeah, I think it's key to understand the problems you're trying to solve and what these practices can help you resolve there. Like with the continuous integration thing, a lot of my XP stuff comes from my first job, where I realized this is not how you build software. There must be a better way than doing this. There was 5 developers working on a single index.pl Perl file, and you could only check it out one person at a time using something called SCCS, which I believe came with the original 1970 Bell Unix system. And it was horrific because if one person wanted to work on the code at any one time, then it was kind of the classic, you have a rubber chicken on top of your monitor kind of problem when we did have monitors that were deep enough to actually put stuff on top of. So that's more of a problem then. And I think you can do it better now with tools like Git to allow that distributed version control system to allow you to better merge stuff in. Whether it goes to the original definition, I don't know. I'm interested to hear more. I want to hear these 3 unreleased podcasts. Maybe they should be released raw, just in their pure form, the bootleg versions.
We should start a sign me petition because I also want to hear them.
It's actually something I'm definitely happy to talk more about. There's a whole bunch of these. Distributed version control is a perfect example of something that people don't understand. I had these arguments with some of the people who started GitHub when they were starting GitHub, because the people who started GitHub didn't, and some of them who were one of the like at least 2 of the founders of GitHub still don't know what distributed version control is. Distributed version control is about having multiple copies of the repo and being able to move things between the repos. As soon as you put GitHub at the center of that and create a hub and spoke model, it is less distributed now. Now, is that good? Is that bad? I think it's, in a lot of ways, it's actually bad for things like continuous integration, because continuous integration implies a single integration point. So maybe GitHub itself is a tool for continuous integration, but GitHub Actions is not a tool for continuous integration necessarily, because you might use something else. So there are a whole bunch of different ideas there. SCCS, I think, was SCCS was a set of patches on top of RCS, which came first, I think. Might be the other way around, though.
Yeah, it's the other way around. I think SCCS is the original.
Yeah, you might be right. And all these things build on each other, right? Because we had SCCS, RCS, CVS, and then CVS had limitations, so we went to Subversion. Now, people say, oh, Git is better than Subversion. Git is actually not any better than Subversion if you're using GitHub and you are pushing very large commits infrequently. Most people that use GitHub would be just as happy with Subversion, and they would not change their workflow whatsoever, because they've just taken Git, a distributed tool, and turned it into a centralized tool. And so, yeah, there's a whole bunch. Sorry, I could absolutely talk about everything that we do and say, look, the thing that we are doing now has absolutely nothing in common with the way that it was intended to be used. And I think we lose a lot in that translation process. And XP is absolutely that thing.
I was just going to remark that, yeah, it feels like the default usage of Git flow is to have I have my branch, I work a month on it, and then I go through merge hell and I do my thing, which is not what you're describing it should be, in the sense that the idea is, yeah, you merge continuously and you might do a feature branch because X or Y, but it gets merged into master every X times, etc., right? I very sadly have to start winding things down because I think I could talk about this for hours. I'm gonna do so with one question that if you had someone entering the software industry right now and you wanted them to get interested in extreme programming, what would you tell them to get them there?
I'd go back to the source, get the book Extreme Programming Explained, version 2. I'd say follow Kent Beck on Substack. He's still writing some good stuff. He released a great article the other week called Forest and Desert, which is like still talking about extreme program practices. There's a website, I think it's extremeprogramming.org, which kind of breaks everything down into little chunks if you just want to kind of go through it and day by day look at different things of it. And I'd say that after what I thought my 18 years was a long time until Stephen came on the call. After my 18 years, whenever I've done extreme programming, it's always delivered success. And when I haven't done it, then it hasn't, or it's been more of a challenge. And I have more fun when I'm doing extreme programming. It just, you build stuff in the right direction, people hassle you less, and you get to work with people you like working with most of the time. So I think doing extreme programming, I will always try and do it because I just enjoy life more with it.
Yeah, if I was trying to introduce it or convince a newbie, I would just show them. When people ask me for help, and it can be, somebody new to the industry, it can be somebody, whatever, my number one thing is pair with me. My open source contributions are minimal now outside of my work because I've lost the ability to write code alone anymore. I just don't like sitting alone and staring at my screen and typing out code. Even on Advent of Code this year, although I did fall off the rails a little bit because I wasn't feeling well last week, I ended up getting a pair to work on that because it's just way more enjoyable and things move faster. And so I would just demonstrate it. Hey, you have this problem you want to solve? Great. Send me a Zoom link and share your screen and we'll flip back and forth. It's great for that.
Yeah, quite an effective way of showing the benefits of it and how it works and to teach someone about it. And with that, the only thing left is thanking you both. It flew by. I had to keep looking at my clock because I was like, okay, we've only been talking for 10 minutes, but no, it's been almost an hour. Thank you both so very much. It was a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for reaching out. I enjoyed the conversation.